Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the North Caucasus, where mountains rise like fortress walls, and the air carries both the scent of pine and the metallic tang of old gunfire. Imagine a small village in Vedeno, tucked in the folds of Chechnya's hills, where winters bite hard and summers hum with the constant buzz of insects. This is where Shamil Basayev first opens his eyes to a world shaped by tradition, clan loyalty, and the ever-present hand of the Soviet state. You can almost hear the distant echo of boots on gravel roads and the murmured conversations in kitchens lit by a single bulb. You probably won't survive this story if you expect it to stay calm and predictable. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Basayev's Boyhood unfolds in an environment where every family knows every other family's history. His parents, modest but respected, raise him with a mix of stern discipline and fierce pride in Chechen heritage. The village lies on a patchwork of small fields, where children herd goats after school, and men meet in the evenings to sip tea and talk politics in low, deliberate tones. Soviet influence is everywhere. Portraits of Lenin in the schoolroom, lessons drilled in Russian. But the private conversations at home are in Chechen, full of old proverbs about honor and revenge. From a young age, he notices how quickly those proverbs leap from talk into action. A dispute over grazing rights can lead to a blood feud, and elders resolve it not with police intervention, but through a strict code of reparation and respect. In the hills, the boys his age learn to move silently, to recognize the sound of a particular horse's hoofbeats, to climb trees not just for fun, but to get a better vantage point. Even games have a military undertone. Mock ambushes in the fields, competitions of stamina in the river's cold current. Shamil, wiry and restless, has a knack for positioning himself as the ringleader in these games. He carries himself with a confidence beyond his years, the kind that draws followers and irritates teachers in equal measure. His school performance is uneven. He absorbs stories of Chechen resistance with rapt attention, but struggles with the imposed Soviet curriculum. Many people still think that these early years, soaked in tales of defiance against outside rule, were the seeds of his later militancy. So what do you think? Was it the land, the culture, or simply his own temperament? The Soviet state looms large, but it's a distant presence here, felt in the conscription notices, the occasional visit from a political officer, and the sense that Moscow's decisions ripple down to this valley months after they're made. Shamil grows up watching his father fix farm machinery with resourcefulness born of scarcity, and his mother keep the household together even during food shortages. The family's small plot provides just enough to keep them self-reliant, a virtue prized as much as courage. By his teens, he begins slipping away to join older cousins on hunting trips that stray far into the hills. These outings are part survival skill, part rite of passage. They return with stories of spotting Russian patrols in the distance, of narrow escapes from border guards who suspect smuggling. Though Shamil isn't yet involved, the thrill of those tales plants a seed. He learns to read the land like a map, where the narrow passes are, which ridges give you sight lines for miles, where the streams run shallow enough to cross without leaving tracks. At home, the family radio sometimes crackles with news from Moscow or Grozny. When talk turns to politics, adults lower their voices, but Shamil listens closely. The language of dissent is never explicit, but the meaning is clear. The Soviets are not to be trusted. He notices the pride that flashes in his father's eyes when an elder recalls Chechen resistance fighters from decades past. In these moments, Shamil absorbs a lesson that no classroom will teach him, that survival here is as much about cunning and unity as it is about force. He isn't yet the man he will become, but already the threads are weaving together. A deep connection to the land, an understanding of loyalty and vengeance, and a fascination with the stories of those who fought and outwitted bigger powers. The mountains are not just a backdrop, they're a school, a fortress, and a promise that if you know them well enough, you can always disappear. Moscow feels like another planet compared to Vedno. Shamil's arrival in the capital is not the grand entry of a young man chasing big dreams. It's more of a calculated step into a larger world. The train ride north is long, the landscapes flattening as the mountains recede, replaced by endless fields and industrial towns, with smoke curling from chimneys. He leans against the window, the rattle of the tracks mixing with the low murmur of passengers trading gossip about prices, politics, and military service. The city greets him with its scale before anything else. Streets wide enough to swallow his entire village, buildings stacked with rows of windows that seem to watch him, and a constant churn of traffic that never pauses. Moscow in the late Soviet years is a mix of gray bureaucracy and underground restlessness. The official culture is rigid, everything plastered with slogans about unity and progress. But the unofficial one thrives in cramped apartments where dissident books and political jokes circulate like contraband. Shamil enrolls at the Moscow Engineering Institute, studying land reclamation and agriculture. On paper, it's a practical course for a rural boy. In reality, the lecture halls are where he's least alive. He sits through equations and soil composition charts, but his real education comes in the dormitories, in smoke-filled kitchens, and at long, meandering walks through the city at night. It's here he meets other young men from the Caucasus, Dagestanis, Ingush, Azeris, each with their own stories of family land, Soviet meddling, and the quiet resistance that never makes it into the newspapers. He finds himself drawn into nationalist circles almost by accident. A casual invitation to come hear this speaker leads to hours listening to impassioned talks about self-determination, history, and the injustices of central control. Some of it feels too ideological, but much of it strikes a chord. He's not yet a militant, but the language of autonomy and dignity begins to wrap itself around his ambitions. Many people still think that Moscow was where he first began to see himself, not just as a Chechen, but as a potential actor in a larger struggle. The contrast between his student life and his origins is stark. Back home, disputes are settled by elders face to face. Here, disagreements are buried under layers of bureaucracy. In Vedeno, your worth is measured by your ability to provide, protect, and remember your obligations. In Moscow, it's who you know and how well you navigate the unspoken rules of favors. Shamil learns both systems: how to smile at the right official, how to find a market stall that sells goods under the table, how to slip into the rhythm of city life without losing the cadence of his home dialect. He also develops a knack for navigating the unspoken alliance among Caucasian students. In bars and at late-night gatherings, they close ranks if one of their own is insulted, and they carry themselves with a quiet defiance that draws attention from other groups. It's here Shamil begins to understand the power of image, how to use posture, voice, and calculated silence to unsettle others without throwing a punch. But Moscow isn't just a stage for political awakening. It's also a place where money moves in strange, hidden currents. He hears about side hustles, selling imported jeans, moving small quantities of foreign electronics that earn more in a week than a stipend provides in a month. Friends introduce him to markets where goods appear without official channels, where a handshake and a cash payment bypass endless paperwork. Shamil watches carefully, not rushing in, but cataloging every trick and contact. Evenings often end with him walking alone through the city, his hands in his coat pockets, the wet cobblestones reflecting the orange glow of street lamps. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he's building a private ledger. What Moscow can teach him, what it can't, and how both might serve him later. He doesn't yet know that his path will soon shift from the capital's back rooms to frontline battlefields, but the pieces are lining up. Contacts, confidence, and the quiet conviction that survival is a game played best by those who never show their full hand. The air in Abkhazia smells of salt and smoke. When Shamil steps off the transport in 1992, he isn't a soldier by profession, but he carries himself like one who's already passed an invisible threshold. The Abkhaz-Georgian conflict is in full surge, and the Black Sea coast, once a holiday escape for Soviet citizens, now feels like a stage for something much darker. Sunlight glints off the waves, but behind the beaches are checkpoints manned by young men with hollow eyes, gripping rifles like they're holding onto their last tether. Shamil comes as a volunteer, answering a call for fighters to aid Abkhaz separatists against Georgian forces. For him, this is part idealism, part opportunity. He sees parallels between Abkhazia's struggle and the simmering unease back home in Chechnya. Here, he can learn how wars are fought in the modern age, not the staged drills of the Soviet army, but the real thing, with blood, fear, and chaos deciding the day's outcome. He finds himself in a mixed unit of Chechens and other North Caucasian volunteers. The men are rough, disciplined only by the shared belief that they're on the right side of history. Shamil gravitates toward the role of problem solver, the one who figures out how to move ammunition under fire, how to negotiate with a stubborn local guide, or how to convince a reluctant villager to part with a needed boat. Leadership doesn't come through orders alone. It comes in the quiet moments when men look for someone to follow in uncertainty, and he learns quickly that fear can be countered with an almost casual tone. Combat here is different from the mountain skirmishes he's heard about back home. Urban firefights break out in narrow streets where balconies become sniper perches. Villages shift hands overnight, with yesterday's defenders vanishing before dawn. He sees how terrain, logistics, and timing matter as much as raw bravery. In one encounter, his group uses fishing boats under cover of night to flank a Georgian position, an idea born from watching how locals navigate the coastline. The plan works, and the success earns him quiet respect among men who aren't easily impressed. War also strips away illusions fast. He sees what hunger does to discipline, how quickly ideals can be traded for a cigarette or a warm coat. Many people still think that this was where Shamil shed whatever innocence he had left, learning that survival often demands compromises far from the purity of speeches. In the lulls between battles, he studies the small economy of war. Abandoned houses become supply depots. Goods, some stolen, some bartered, move in quiet exchanges between fighters and civilians. He watches as commanders cultivate relationships not just with their own men, but with merchants, fishermen, even enemy sympathizers. all to keep the flow of resources steady. The lesson is clear. A warlord isn't just a battlefield tactician. He's a broker, a negotiator, a master of shifting alliances. There's a darker side too. Prisoners are taken, and their fate isn't always decided by official command. Ransoms are discussed like the price of livestock, and Shamil listens more than he speaks, weighing the utility of such practices against the risks they carry. He files it away, another tool in the growing kit of methods he may one day use. By the time the conflict edges toward its uneasy end, Shamil has earned more than battlefield experience. He's picked up contacts, fighters, smugglers, political fixers from across the Caucasus. He's learned how to read the signs of an impending attack, how to vanish when the balance turns against you, and how to carry yourself in a negotiation so the other side never quite knows how desperate or dangerous you really are. When he finally leaves Abkhazia, the mountains of Chechnya are calling him back, but he returns with something new. The confidence of someone who has walked into war as an outsider and walked out not just alive, but sharper, better connected, and far more dangerous than when he arrived. The road home to Chechnya winds through valleys where autumn leaves have turned the hills into a patchwork of gold and rust. Shamil rides in the back of an old military truck, his gear tucked in beside him, the rumble of the engine mixing with the muffled conversations of men half dozing against their rifles. Abkhazia is behind him now, but the lessons he's carried back weigh more than the pack on his shoulders. When he steps into Vedeno again, the village feels smaller. The familiar mountains still loom, but after seeing other battlefields, other cultures, they no longer hold the same air of isolation. He moves differently now, his gaze scanning rooftops and tree lines without thinking, his stride carrying the unhurried certainty of someone who knows how to handle himself in danger. Neighbors notice it. Elders notice it. And soon, so do the men already whispering about Chechnya's rising call for independence. The early 1990s are a time when every conversation seems to circle back to the same question. Can Chechnya stand on its own? Soviet collapse has left cracks in the old structure, and in those cracks, ambition and unrest grow. Shamil begins visiting gatherings where fighters, local leaders, and ideologues debate strategy over tea. At first, he listens more than he speaks, letting others measure him. The Abkhazia stories travel faster than he does, tales of his resourcefulness, his calm under fire, his knack for making the improbable work. Soon he's no longer just an audience member. He starts speaking up, offering suggestions for securing supply lines, for recruiting men who can be trusted, for moving quietly between villages without attracting unwanted Russian attention. It's not theory anymore. These are techniques he's tested. Many people still think that it was in these dimly lit kitchens and crowded back rooms that Shamil first mapped out the structure of his future operations. The fighters he draws close are not the loudest or the most visibly aggressive. They're the ones who know the mountains like they know their own hands. The ones with unshakable patience. The ones who understand that winning sometimes means not fighting at all. His circle is small, but loyalty is deep, and each man brings something unique. Connections to black market traders, skill in explosives, knowledge of border terrain. He also starts to notice how war and profit overlap. Even in peacetime, money changes hands for protection against theft, for help moving goods across checkpoints, for resolving disputes that police either ignore or exploit. Shamil understands instinctively that any armed movement will need more than ideology to survive. It will need a constant flow of resources. he positions himself as someone who can make those flows happen. But there's another layer too. He keeps one foot in the political space, cultivating ties with local leaders who see him as a rising figure. He's careful not to appear as just another fighter. He's a bridge between the man with a gun and the man who claims to speak for the people. It's a role that demands a certain performance, and Shamil has learned to wear the right face for the right audience. By late 1993, the lines between armed struggle, political maneuvering, and criminal enterprise are blurring. Russian presence in the region remains, but their grip feels weaker. The air is thick with the expectation that something, war, rebellion, a full break, will come soon. And when it does, Shamil intends not just to be part of it, but to shape it. Evenings often find him standing outside, the cold mountain air biting his cheeks, staring at the road leading out of Vedeno. Beyond that road lies Grozny, and beyond Grozny, the vast Russian expanse he has already touched. The village no longer feels like the boundary of his world. It feels like the center point of a map that's slowly expanding, with him at the heart of it, waiting for the moment to push outward. The winter of 1994 in Chechnya carries a tense stillness, like a long inhale before a shout. Snow clings to rooftops and pine branches, softening the jagged outlines of war talk. But beneath that quiet, every man with a rifle is waiting. Shamil's name is now circulating beyond Vedeno. Word of his Abkhaz service and his knack for logistics has reached Grozny, where the separatist leadership is gathering momentum for a full-scale break from Moscow. By February, he's making regular trips to the capital, moving between safe houses and shadowy meeting rooms where tea is served in chipped glasses and discussions stretch into the early morning. The city buzzes with militia recruitment. Old Soviet weapons, some bought, some stolen, are stacked in basements and warehouses. Young men loiter outside cafes, eager to be noticed by someone who can give them purpose. Shamil, never one for loud speeches, earns their attention by doing something more valuable, making things happen. In these months, he proves himself as both a fighter and a fixer. When a shipment of ammunition from a southern route stalls due to a border dispute, he finds a way to redirect it through side paths known only to smugglers. When two rival groups of fighters threaten to derail a joint operation with infighting, he's the one who sits them down, cool voice steady, and convinces them there's more to gain together than apart. He knows the power of shared profit as much as shared ideology. As spring turns to summer, the First Chechen War breaks open. Russian forces push in, expecting a quick victory. They meet instead a loose but determined resistance that knows every street and hillside. Shamil moves between units, not tied to any single commander, but working with all who share the aim of driving the Russians out. Many people still think that this was the moment he stopped being merely a participant and became a central node, someone without whom operations would stall. His tactical instincts sharpen quickly in the chaos. He favors mobility over holding ground, preferring to hit hard and vanish before the counterattack. In Grozny, he uses the dense urban terrain to his advantage, leading small groups through alleys and half-collapsed buildings to strike supply convoys. In the countryside, he draws Russian patrols into ambushes where the land itself becomes a weapon. But even as he earns a reputation on the front lines, Shamil is cultivating a quieter war, one fought in deals, bribes, and secret exchanges. He builds relationships with those who can supply fuel, food, and information, whether they're Chechen civilians, corrupt Russian officers, or foreign intermediaries. He's not above paying for silence or safe passage if it preserves his strength for the fights that matter. the duality of his role begins to crystallize: warlord and extortionist, patriot and profiteer. The lines are thin and often crossed without hesitation. He demands donations from businesses in Grozny to fund operations, framing it as a necessary contribution to the cause. Some pay willingly, others do so because the alternative is unthinkable. Either way, the flow of money and goods into his hands grows. Late in the year, a skirmish near Argon cements his standing among the fighters. Outnumbered and low on ammunition, his group manages to hold off a Russian advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive. It's a victory measured less in territory than in morale. A reminder to the men that the fight is far from over. Around the fire that night, as they share what little food they have, the talk shifts from survival to strategy. And more than one fighter looks to Shamil when the question of what next is asked. Winter comes again, harsher than before. The war has stripped the land of much, but for Shamil, it has given him something he's been building toward since his youth: influence, reach, and the confidence to act on both without asking permission. The quiet boy from Vedeno is gone. In his place stands a man who has learned that in a war like this, the sharpest weapon is not the rifle. It's the ability to control the flow of everything else. The summer heat of 1995 settles heavy over the steppe, thick with dust and the smell of fuel. In the small town of Budyonovsk, hundreds of kilometers from Chechnya, people go about their routines, shopping for bread, visiting the market, queuing at the post office, unaware that their town is about to be carved into the pages of history. For Shamil, this will be the operation that defines him far beyond the mountains, a move both daring and deeply controversial. The train hostage crisis. It begins with meticulous planning. Weeks before, Shamil quietly assembles a team of fighters, some veterans from the Abkhaz War, others drawn from Chechnya's growing pool of restless young men. They gather in rural safe houses, poring over maps and timetables. The target is not chosen at random. A raid this far from the conflict zone will send a shock wave into the Russian public consciousness, forcing Moscow to confront Chechen demands directly. The journey north is cloaked in the anonymity of the railway system. Disguised as ordinary passengers, the fighters carry weapons in sacks and crates marked as produce. They sit silently among civilians, the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels underscoring the unspoken tension. Shamil, calm as ever, plays the part of a man traveling on routine business, his eyes betraying nothing of what lies ahead. When the crisis erupts, it does so with brutal precision. The fighters seize control of the train and redirect it toward Budyonovsk, where they storm the local hospital, corralling more than 1,000 hostages, patients, doctors, and visitors alike. Shamil takes the lead in negotiations, his voice low and steady, demanding an end to Russian military operations in Chechnya. The standoff becomes a national spectacle, broadcast live and replayed in every corner of the country. Inside the hospital, the air is a mix of fear and uneasy order. Shamil ensures hostages are given food and water, a gesture meant as much for optics as for conscience. He moves among them not as a raving militant, but as a figure of unsettling composure. Some hostages later recall moments when his tone seemed almost gentle. Others remember the cold finality in his eyes when demands were refused. Outside, Russian forces encircle the building. The tension ratchets higher with each hour. Negotiations stall, then lurch forward again, a grim dance of threats and concessions. Eventually, a deal is struck. Shamil and his men will be granted safe passage back to Chechnya in exchange for the release of the hostages. The compromise enrages many in Moscow, but spares the lives of most inside. The aftermath is explosive. Across Russia, the name Shamil Basayev becomes synonymous with both ruthless terrorism and strategic brilliance. International media frame him as a warlord who can outmaneuver the Kremlin, while within Chechnya, he's hailed by some as a hero who forced the Russians to blink. Many people still think that Budyonovsk was the turning point, where Shamil's reputation solidified into something mythic, half feared, half admired. Privately, he knows the raid has bought time, leverage, and notoriety. It has also painted a permanent target on his back. The Russian state will not forget nor forgive this humiliation. But Shamil thrives in the space between danger and opportunity. Even as he slips back into Chechen territory, greeted by supporters, he's already thinking about the next move, how to turn this surge of influence into deeper control over the war effort and the economy that feeds it. That night, as he sits in a dimly lit farmhouse outside Vedeno, he listens to the distant pop of gunfire echoing from some other skirmish. He doesn't flinch. To him, this is the sound of the game he's chosen, one where the stakes are as high as the mountains themselves, and where he intends to keep climbing, no matter how steep the next slope becomes. The months after Budyonovsk bring a strange duality to Shamil's life. On one hand, he is hunted more relentlessly than ever, his name broadcast on Russian state television as the nation's most dangerous man, his face printed on wanted posters and intelligence briefs. On the other, his status inside Chechnya swells to new heights. Fighters who once questioned his authority now seek him out, eager to be part of whatever operation he conceives next. This is when his reach begins stretching beyond the mountains. In dimly lit back rooms in Grozny, he meets with men from the North Caucasus, the Middle East, and even the fringes of Eastern Europe. They speak in low tones about weapons shipments, routes for moving goods, and safe houses far from Chechnya's front lines. These aren't just fellow militants. They're arms brokers, black market fixers, and shadowy intermediaries who can provide anything for a price. Shamil listens more than he talks, making notes in his head about who delivers and who boasts without proof. One of his first international connections comes through an old Abkhaz contact who introduces him to a network operating in Turkey. From there, Shamil begins cultivating ties to men who can move crates of ammunition disguised as farm equipment, or rifles hidden inside shipments of construction materials. The deals are rarely straightforward. Payments are made in cash one day, in promises of future favors the next. He learns to balance charm with intimidation, knowing that too much of either can sour a partnership. His operational style evolves as these networks grow. No longer content to rely solely on local raids or seized Russian stockpiles, he starts importing high-quality small arms and specialized explosives. This shift changes the battlefield. His units can now match or even outgun some Russian detachments in short engagements, making hit-and-run tactics even deadlier. But the weapons trade is only part of the equation. With the war draining resources, Shamil begins using these contacts to secure other essentials: medicine, satellite phones, spare parts for vehicles. Each new link in the chain strengthens his autonomy. He becomes less dependent on other Chechen commanders, able to equip and supply his own men without asking permission or sharing credit. Many people still think that this period marked his transition from a purely local figure to a regional player in the black market economy of war. His name starts appearing in foreign intelligence chatter, tied not only to attacks, but to the shadow commerce that sustains conflicts. There are risks, of course. Every meeting with an outsider carries the possibility of betrayal. Russian intelligence grows increasingly aggressive in tracking these channels, sometimes intercepting couriers, sometimes planting false offers to draw him out. Shamil adapts by using layers of intermediaries, people who may not even know they're working for him directly. This insulation slows operations, but makes him harder to reach. Meanwhile, his political profile remains intact. When local leaders need weapons or supplies for their fighters, they know who to call. When foreign journalists sneak into Chechnya to cover the war, they often end up hearing about the elusive figure who seems able to conjure resources out of thin air. Shamil rarely speaks to them directly, preferring to let the mystery grow on its own. By late 1995, he's moving between villages with the ease of someone who knows every back trail and safe house in the region. His convoy might be 3 battered jeeps today, a string of pack horses tomorrow. The routes change constantly, but the destination is always the same: to expand the reach of his operations while keeping one step ahead of the men sent to stop him. One cold evening, sitting in a safe house lit by a single lantern, he flips through a small notebook filled with scrawled names, numbers, and cryptic reminders. It's not a diary. It's a ledger of debts owed, favors promised, and connections that might, at the right moment, be worth more than a rifle in hand. The man who once roamed Moscow's streets as a drifting student has become a broker of both war and survival, his influence stretching far beyond the snow-covered valleys of Chechnya. In the mountains of Chechnya, loyalty is a currency, and Shamil spends it wisely. By 1996, he has built a web of relationships that tie him not just to fighters and commanders, but to the smallest, most trusted circles within villages scattered across the highlands. These aren't formal alliances sealed with documents. They're handshakes in kitchens, whispered oaths in doorways, and promises made over shared bread. The structure is simple but effective. Each village has its own informal leader, sometimes an elder, sometimes a younger man with the respect of the locals, who acts as Shamil's point of contact. These men pass along information, warn of approaching Russian patrols, and provide shelter when his fighters need to vanish for a few days. In return, Shamil ensures the village has what it needs: protection from rival militias, food supplies in lean months, and the occasional delivery of medicine or spare parts. This network serves more than just his military operations. It becomes the backbone of his extortion system. Businesses, farmers, and even transport operators within these areas begin paying what is politely called a security fee. The arrangement is dressed in the language of mutual aid, but everyone understands the truth. Paying Shamil means your family and livelihood stay safe. Refuse, and problems begin. Livestock stolen, shipments delayed, officials suddenly hostile. It's not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It's calculated pressure, the kind that makes non-compliance unthinkable. Many people still think that this village-based network was the most important part of his rise. Guns could be seized or bought, but loyalty, especially in these hills, had to be grown like a crop, season after season. Shamil doesn't just rely on threats. He invests in his image, visiting villages in person, remembering names, and asking after families. His charisma works in tandem with his reputation for decisive action. When a Russian patrol harasses a remote farming community, he sends men to ambush them on the road back to base. When a trader's son is kidnapped by bandits from across the border, Shamil retrieves him within days, making sure word spreads about who made it happen. These gestures, part genuine and part performative, ensure that even those who dislike his methods acknowledge his effectiveness. To many in the highlands, he's not merely a warlord, he's a necessary force, the only one capable of navigating the thin line between survival and destruction in a land caught between Russian firepower and internal chaos. His fighters mirror this adaptability. They know how to blend into a village market one day, then vanish into the tree line the next. They carry their rifles like extensions of themselves, but they also carry tools, trade goods, and sometimes gifts, items that reinforce goodwill where it's needed most. Behind closed doors, Shamil uses the network to move contraband, arms from abroad, black market fuel, even luxury goods for high-ranking Chechen officials who prefer not to be seen buying directly. Every transaction reinforces his central role. Nothing of value enters or leaves these hills without his knowledge, and usually without his cut. By the end of 1996, his influence has grown so deeply into the soil of these villages that removing him would mean tearing apart the social fabric itself, and he knows it. Sitting by a fire one night, mountains silhouetted against a sliver of moon, he tells a trusted lieutenant, "The Russians can bomb Grozny until there's nothing left, but they can't bomb trust out of a man's heart. If we keep that, we keep everything." It's a truth he's learned since childhood, refined through war and necessity. Guns win battles, but relationships win wars. And in Chechnya's hills, Shamil is winning both. By early 1997, Shamil's operations move beyond the borders of Chechnya's war zones into a realm that feels more like the shadow markets of a frontier state. The fighting may slow at times, but the commerce of conflict never does, and Shamil positions himself squarely at its center. The most lucrative streams come from smuggling, routes that snake through the mountains, cross into Georgia or Dagestan, and connect with ports on the Caspian and Black Seas. What moves along these lines changes week by week. Crates of Kalashnikovs, shipments of diesel fuel, boxes of medicine stamped with foreign labels, even satellite communication gear. Some of it is destined for Chechen fighters, some for other conflicts, and some simply for the highest bidder. Control of these routes requires more than armed escorts. It means knowing every pass, every gully, every checkpoint where a bribe will open the gate faster than a firefight. Shamil's men learn the art of moving goods under the guise of legitimate trade. A truck filled with sacks of grain might hide ammunition beneath a false floor. A convoy of livestock could conceal a crate of radios wrapped in burlap. Each shipment carries a portion of his wealth, but also his reputation. Failure isn't tolerated. His presence in the black market world grows strong enough that even rivals seek his permission to move certain goods through his territory. They understand the stakes. Operating without his blessing risks not only confiscation, but retaliation that can make a man vanish in the folds of the hills. The tax he imposes is high, but it guarantees passage, protection, and perhaps most importantly, his word that the route will remain open. Many people still think that this period was when Shamil became less a battlefield commander and more a war economy architect. While others counted their victories in skirmishes, he measured his in tonnage moved and profits banked. This control over trade isn't just about money, it's a strategic tool. By deciding who gets weapons or fuel, Shamil can influence which factions rise or fall. If a commander proves disloyal, his supply dries up. If a potential ally needs persuading, a few shipments of badly needed ammunition can shift his loyalty. In a fractured conflict where alliances change as quickly as the weather, this power is worth more than territory. Operating on this scale requires external connections. Shamil keeps close contact with Turkish smugglers, Azerbaijani traders, and even a few shadowy figures rumored to have Balkan War experience. The deals are conducted in whispers, often through intermediaries, with meetings arranged in places where the sound of the sea or the rush of river water can muffle conversation. At home, these ventures bring visible changes. His fighters wear newer gear, carry better weapons, and eat better than most Chechen units. Vehicles in his convoys are maintained to a standard rare in the war's chaos, allowing him to strike fast or disappear entirely before Russian forces can react. But the deeper he dives into the black market trade, the more dangerous the currents become. Rival groups covet his routes. Russian intelligence increases its pressure, planting informants and intercepting shipments when possible. Shamil adapts by scattering his operations. No single person, not even his closest lieutenants, knows the full picture of his network. Each route operates like a separate vein, connected to the heart, but able to close off if poisoned. In late autumn, as snow begins dusting the high passes, Shamil rides along one of his southern routes. The convoy moves in near silence, headlights covered, engines humming low. He studies the dark outline of the hills and thinks not of the goods in the trucks, but of the leverage they represent. Every crate, every barrel, is a step toward the independence he claims to fight for, or at least the power to survive, no matter how the war's tides turn. The quiet side of Shamil's war unfolds far from the rattle of gunfire, in dimly lit rooms where the smell of strong tea mingles with cigarette smoke, where voices are kept low, but words carry weight. By 1998, he's more than a commander in the field. He's become a negotiator in the shadows, a man who can sit across from sworn enemies if there's something to be gained. Negotiation, for him, is never about friendship. It's about leverage. He meets with Russian officers who would gladly see him dead, yet they share the table because both sides have something the other needs. Sometimes it's prisoners. Sometimes it's information. More often, it's the unspoken desire to pause the fighting just long enough to rearm, reposition, or allow political winds to shift. In one meeting outside Grozny, Shamil sits opposite a Russian colonel whose men have been taking steady losses in the hills. The colonel wants the return of 2 captured soldiers. Shamil wants the release of a Chechen elder held in a military detention center. They both know the exchange is possible, but neither will admit it outright. The conversation drifts in circles for hours, punctuated by small courtesies, offers of bread, refills of tea, until both men finally nod, the deal made without a single formal document. Within days, the prisoners change hands, each side claiming the outcome as a quiet victory. Shamil's diplomacy is not limited to the enemy. He brokers understandings between rival Chechen commanders, some of whom are as hostile to each other as they are to the Russians. These truces are fragile, often held together only by Shamil's personal assurance and his control over key supply lines. If tempers flare, he can cool them with promises, or cut off a lifeline until reason returns. Many people still think that this talent for balancing between enemies and allies kept Chechnya's fractured resistance from splintering entirely during these years. Without figures like him, the internal feuds might have consumed the movement from within. He also maintains a careful dance with foreign intermediaries. Humanitarian workers, journalists, and even political envoys sometimes cross his path, each with their own agenda. Shamil treats them as pieces on a larger board, sources of publicity, leverage, or resources, depending on the moment. He's careful never to overpromise, offering just enough to keep the line open without revealing his full position. These negotiations serve another purpose. They shape his image. While Russian media paints him as a bandit and terrorist, these discreet talks allow him to present himself, in certain circles, as a pragmatic actor, someone capable of reasoned compromise, even if it serves only his own ends. This dual image confuses his enemies and intrigues outsiders, giving him room to maneuver in ways a purely militant figure could not. In the villages, word spreads that Shamil can speak to anyone. For his supporters, it's proof of his cunning. For his detractors, it's evidence of opportunism. Either way, it reinforces the central truth of his power. In a war where trust is scarce, he remains a man people are willing to deal with, even those who might try to kill him the next day. One evening, after concluding a tense meeting in a farmhouse tucked high in the hills, Shamil steps outside into the cold. The valley below is cloaked in fog, the moon a thin silver arc above the ridgeline. He pulls his coat tighter and listens to the faint sounds of his men packing up inside. Deals have been made, lines drawn, promises exchanged. Tomorrow, the war will resume. But tonight, in this quiet pocket of time, the battlefield feels far away, and the real war, the one of words, leverage, and calculated trust, has been fought and won. By 1999, the war has shifted again, and so has Shamil's approach. Russian offensives grow heavier, their convoys longer, their airstrikes more frequent. Yet, for every adjustment the Kremlin makes, Shamil crafts a countermeasure. His fighters move like water, splitting, merging, disappearing into forests and villages, only to reappear where they're least expected. He begins refining his tactics to match the pressure. Gone are the large, noisy convoys that draw attention. Instead, his units travel in smaller groups, blending with civilian movement or posing as traders. They carry lighter weapons, but more communications gear, allowing them to coordinate strikes over larger areas. This mobility becomes their shield and their blade. One hallmark of Shamil's evolving strategy is the rapid strike. A Russian outpost might be silent one moment and under fire the next, attacked from multiple angles by men who vanish before reinforcements arrive. These engagements aren't about holding ground. They're about bleeding resources, spreading fear, and forcing the enemy to commit more forces to defend less territory. In the mountains near Vedeno, his men set up a classic feint. A small team draws Russian troops into a narrow pass, then retreats. As the soldiers pursue, they're caught in overlapping fire from hidden positions. The skirmish lasts minutes, but the psychological toll lingers. Soldiers begin refusing to patrol certain routes, convinced they're walking into traps. Shamil also invests in training. He pulls promising recruits from the villages and runs them through exercises in both mountain and urban terrain. He insists on discipline, not the stiff formality of a standing army, but the kind that keeps a man from lighting a cigarette when an enemy helicopter might be scanning the valley. Training sessions include navigation by stars, silent communication, and improvisation with whatever materials are at hand. Many people still think that these years cemented his reputation as one of the most adaptive commanders in the conflict. While other leaders stuck to familiar patterns, Shamil's willingness to change made him unpredictable, and therefore dangerous. The adaptability extends beyond combat. He modifies his supply chain to withstand Russian crackdowns, splitting shipments into smaller loads and routing them through more hands. It's slower, but harder to intercept entirely. He even experiments with misinformation, allowing rumors of large operations to leak, drawing Russian forces into the wrong areas, while his real targets remain untouched. Still, this flexibility comes at a cost. smaller units mean fewer men in any one fight, and rapid strikes mean fewer opportunities for decisive victories. His war becomes one of attrition, both for his enemies and for himself. Each operation drains resources that are harder to replace as Russian forces tighten control over key roads and towns. Late in the year, during a quiet night in a mountain encampment, Shamil studies a map by lantern light. His fingers trace the winding lines of the Argun Gorge, the dotted paths over high passes, the scattered villages that still answer his calls. He knows the landscape like a living thing, its moods, its strengths, its betrayals. The Russians may have numbers and machines, but he has the ground under his feet and the knowledge of how to move through it like smoke. Outside, the wind picks up, carrying the scent of pine and the faint echo of distant gunfire. To Shamil, it's just another reminder that in this war, survival belongs not to the strongest or the most heavily armed, but to the one who can shift shape faster than the enemy can draw a bead. By the turn of the millennium, Shamil has mastered a weapon that doesn't require bullets, fear wrapped in profit. Kidnapping becomes his most profitable and unsettling tool, a method that blurs the lines between political statement and pure business. The targets vary. Some are Russian soldiers taken in ambushes. Others are foreign journalists or aid workers who wander too close to the wrong checkpoint. Wealthy locals with business ties to Moscow also find themselves on his lists. Each capture is calculated. Shamil doesn't waste resources on someone without either financial value or political leverage. Once a target is seized, they disappear into the folds of the mountains or are moved between safe houses deep in forested valleys. Negotiations for their release are handled through a labyrinth of intermediaries, family contacts, corrupt officials, businessmen who know how to speak on both sides. Ransoms can range from modest sums to amounts capable of funding entire operations for months. Many people still think that this strategy, while brutal, gave Shamil a funding stream more stable than any foreign support. Arms and supplies could be bought without waiting for donors or shipments. The ransom money flowed directly into his war chest, paying fighters, purchasing equipment, and greasing the palms of those whose cooperation was essential. The practice also served another purpose. It sowed uncertainty far beyond the battlefield. Foreign organizations began warning their personnel to avoid Chechnya entirely, and journalists weighed the risk of entering without guarantees of protection. The message was clear. Shamil's reach was not confined to open combat. It extended into the private lives of anyone within his orbit. In one notorious case, a high-profile aid worker was taken from a convoy near Grozny. The seizure was so swift that the rest of the group barely realized what had happened before the vehicles rolled away. Weeks later, the captive was freed, reportedly after a substantial payment and an unspoken agreement to provide discreet logistical assistance in the future. Whether that agreement was honored or not, the incident cemented the image of Shamil as a man who could dictate terms from the shadows. He rarely appeared at the negotiation table himself, preferring to let trusted lieutenants handle the dangerous exchange zones. These meetings, often in remote fields or along unmarked roads, carried their own rules. Hostages shown, but not released until money was counted. Weapons carried openly, but muzzles kept low. Tension thick enough to make even seasoned fighters sweat. The profitability of kidnapping drew imitators, and soon other groups began snatching their own targets, sometimes falsely claiming affiliation with Shamil to boost ransom demands. This posed a risk. Too much chaos could undermine the credibility that made his own operations so effective. To counter this, he quietly punished groups that crossed certain lines, sending the message that the business had boundaries, even if the law did not. By the end of 2000, Shamil's kidnapping operations had become as feared as his military strikes. Both served the same purpose: to fund his war, expand his influence, and remind every player in the conflict, Russian, Chechen, or foreign, that his reach was long, his patience was endless, and his grasp on the war's economics was as firm as his hold on the trigger. By 2001, Shamil is no longer just a problem for Russian military planners. He's a persistent thorn in the Kremlin's pride. Moscow labels him their most wanted, a title that only sharpens his legend among supporters. Every attempt to corner him ends the same way: a burst of fighting, a sudden withdrawal, and a vanishing act into the hills. The Russians throw resources at the hunt: tracking teams, informant networks, aerial surveillance. But the terrain and Shamil's methods make him a phantom. He changes safe houses constantly, never sleeping in the same bed twice. Convoys are disguised as civilian traffic, and routes are altered mid-journey to avoid ambushes. Sometimes he travels alone or with only a single guard, knowing a small footprint draws less attention. Part of his survival comes from bribery. Local officials, Chechen and Russian alike, occasionally find themselves approached with envelopes or favors in exchange for silence. A checkpoint commander might look the other way as Shamil's vehicle passes. A clerk might misplace critical paperwork or delay an operation just long enough for him to slip out of a targeted area. These arrangements are never permanent, but they're enough to keep him one step ahead. Many people still think that his most powerful shield was not the rifle or the mountain, but the network of human connections he'd cultivated over years. Every village elder who owed him a favor, every trader whose goods he'd protected, every family he'd helped in the past, they all formed an invisible barrier around him. The Russians could bomb a hillside, but they couldn't bomb the loyalties woven into its people. The constant pressure forces him to innovate. He uses decoys, sending convoys with lookalikes or false intelligence about his location to split enemy forces. When Russian troops raid a suspected hideout, they often find only empty rooms and cold stoves. His fighters call it Shamil's ghost work, a kind of warfare that leaves the enemy chasing shadows. This cat and mouse dynamic bleeds into his public image. Supporters in Chechnya and beyond see him as uncatchable, a living symbol of defiance. For the Russian public, he's a reminder of unfinished business, a man whose very survival is a challenge to state authority. Both sides feed the myth, willingly or not, yet the strain is constant. Moving so often wears on his men, and resources are harder to stockpile when every hideout risks discovery. Shamil begins to rely more on small, self-sufficient units that can operate without direct oversight, trusting commanders he's trained to carry out his vision. This decentralization makes him harder to eliminate. Killing one cell doesn't cripple the whole network, but it also means surrendering some control. In the winter of 2001, Russian forces claim to have surrounded him in a remote gorge. For 3 days, artillery pounds the area, helicopters sweep the skies, and soldiers comb the ridgelines. When they finally move in, they find nothing but empty dugouts and discarded shell casings. Somewhere, miles away, Shamil sits in a shepherd's hut, sipping tea and listening to a crackling radio report on his inevitable capture. He smiles at the irony. For him, survival is not just about slipping away. It's about making the enemy believe he's everywhere and nowhere at once. And as long as that belief holds, the war, for him, is far from over. By 2002, Shamil's war takes on a new dimension. The conflict in Chechnya is still grinding, but the lines between local insurgency and a broader ideological struggle are blurring. Into this space step foreign fighters, veterans from Afghanistan, the Middle East, and parts of Central Asia, bringing with them not just new tactics, but new narratives. Shamil, ever the opportunist, sees the potential in aligning with them, though on his own terms. These connections don't happen by accident. Through intermediaries in the North Caucasus and Turkey, Shamil meets envoys linked to Islamist networks. They bring promises of funding, equipment, and men willing to fight without pay, fueled by ideology alone. In return, they want a stage, a place to plant their flag in the ongoing conflict. Shamil knows the value of such alliances, but he also knows their risks. Too much foreign influence could alienate local fighters or shift the movement's focus away from Chechnya's nationalist cause. The balance he strikes is deliberate. He accepts what he needs: money, training expertise, and select weapon shipments, while ensuring that operational control stays in his hands. In the camps scattered through the mountains, foreign instructors teach advanced explosives handling, urban assault techniques, and the use of improvised devices. His men absorb these skills quickly, blending them into the guerrilla warfare they've already mastered. The presence of foreign fighters also adds a layer of psychological pressure on the Russians. Moscow portrays the conflict as part of a global terrorist network, hoping to gain international backing for a harsher crackdown. Shamil uses this narrative in reverse, suggesting to sympathetic audiences abroad that Chechnya is part of a broader struggle against oppression, a cause worthy of support. Many people still think that this period marked his pivot from a primarily nationalist figure to one whose rhetoric and alliances began to echo global jihadist themes. Whether this was genuine transformation or calculated branding remains a subject of debate. Operationally, the benefits are clear. The influx of resources allows Shamil to mount more complex and coordinated attacks. Small-scale ambushes give way to multi-pronged strikes, involving simultaneous assaults on military checkpoints, convoys, and communications posts. He starts experimenting with operations that hit deep into enemy-held territory, forcing Russian forces to stretch themselves thinner. But the ideological shift also changes the atmosphere within his ranks. Some veteran fighters, wary of foreign influence, question whether the cause is still purely about Chechen independence. Shamil addresses them directly, framing the foreign presence as a temporary partnership, a means to an end. We take what we need, we give what we must, and we remain our own, he reportedly tells them during one winter gathering in a mountain hideout outside Chechnya. These new alliances open doors. Contacts in the Middle East help arrange safe transit routes for couriers and provide false documentation for operatives moving through Europe and Asia. It's a network built for endurance, one that ensures, even if Russian forces tighten their grip at home, Shamil's operations can still breathe. In private, though, he remains cautious. He knows foreign alliances can shift as quickly as mountain weather, and that outsiders often leave when the terrain turns against them. His core loyalty remains to his own survival and the network he's built over decades, the one woven through villages, smuggling routes, and personal debts. The foreign fighters are a tool, useful but never indispensable. By the end of 2002, Shamil's name is no longer just a Chechen problem. Intelligence agencies from multiple countries are tracking him, adding his profile to lists that stretch far beyond the Caucasus. In the mountains, however, he is still what he has always been: a man who knows how to take what the world offers, reshape it to his advantage, and keep moving before anyone can close the door. The Second Chechen War is at full boil by 2003, and the chaos works in Shamil's favor. Russian forces push deeper into the Republic, tightening their control over towns and main roads. But the harder they press, the more cracks appear for him to slip through. His units are leaner now, fewer large gatherings, more autonomous cells capable of striking without direct orders. This decentralization means he can operate even when communication lines are strained or broken. From the hills above Grozny, he studies the city's skyline. Scaffolds on bombed-out buildings, plumes of smoke where reconstruction mixes with sporadic fighting. The war is no longer about large, decisive battles. It's about wearing the enemy down until their will to hold the territory falters. Shamil understands that each ambush, each roadside explosion, is not just a tactical blow. It's a message that the land is still contested. The flow of resources from his earlier smuggling networks remains steady, though under constant threat. To keep it alive, he shifts more goods through Dagestan and uses smaller caches hidden in shepherds' huts and forest dugouts. His men rotate these supplies constantly, ensuring no location stays valuable long enough for Russian intelligence to pinpoint it. The war economy he's built adapts like a living organism, each part ready to seal itself off if threatened. One operation that spring demonstrates his method perfectly. Russian forces secure a stretch of highway used for troop movements. Within days, Shamil's men plant explosives along the route, timing the attack for a supply convoy. The blast cripples several vehicles, and before reinforcements arrive, his fighters melt back into the tree line. It's not about holding the road. It's about showing they can take it away any time they choose. Many people still think that by this point, Shamil was less concerned with conventional victory and more focused on making the Russian presence so costly that withdrawal would seem like the only rational option. His influence within the resistance remains strong, though the movement itself is fractured. Some commanders lean toward negotiation, others push for an even more radical fight. Shamil navigates between them, trading favors and supplies for loyalty. When talks break down, he's often the one to keep disputes from turning into open bloodshed among Chechen factions. But the war has changed him. His rhetoric is sharper now, tinged with the global jihadist language he began adopting in earlier years. Foreign fighters still trickle in, bringing with them new skills and equipment, but also a harder ideological edge. Shamil uses their expertise for training and operations, yet remains careful not to let them dictate strategy. Winter finds him in a mountain village, sitting with elders around a wood-burning stove. Outside, snow falls in thick silence. Inside, the talk is of food shortages, missing sons, and the endless drone of Russian helicopters overhead. He promises the elders that their supplies will be replenished before the month ends, whether it's done through purchase, theft, or barter. He knows keeping that promise is as critical as any military strike, for in this war, survival is more than staying alive. It's keeping your word to those whose faith keeps your name whispered in loyalty rather than fear. And as long as the villages speak his name with respect, the war, his war, still has a heartbeat. By 2004, the fight has spilled far beyond Chechnya's jagged borders. Shamil's reach now extends into Russian cities, carried out through the quiet work of urban terror cells. These are not the roaming mountain units that fight and vanish into the mist. These are embedded operatives, men and women who live among their targets, blending into the noise of daily life until the day they act. The shift to urban operations isn't just tactical, it's psychological. Moscow may present the war as contained, a distant problem in the Caucasus, but Shamil wants to prove otherwise. Strikes deep in the heart of Russia make the conflict personal for civilians hundreds of miles from the front lines. They also force the Kremlin to divide its resources, stretching security forces thin across the vast country. The cells are small, often no more than 3 to 5 people, and they operate with a level of compartmentalization that even Shamil himself sometimes only partly oversees. Some are tasked with reconnaissance, mapping police patrol patterns, identifying weak points in infrastructure. Others focus on acquiring materials and safe houses. A few are trained for the execution of high-impact attacks designed to cause maximum disruption, with minimal logistical footprint. Many people still think that this expansion into Russian cities was one of his boldest and most dangerous moves. It broke the illusion of distance between the capital and the war zone, a reminder that conflict could erupt in a marketplace or a subway station as easily as in a Grozny back street. His role in these operations is as architect and strategist. He approves the broad strokes, sets the objectives, and ensures that the cells receive the funding and training they need. He's careful to avoid micromanagement. The strength of these units lies in their ability to function independently without waiting for word from the mountains. If one cell is compromised, the others remain intact. The training for these cells often happens in rural Chechnya or hidden camps in neighboring republics. Foreign instructors sometimes participate, teaching surveillance evasion, bomb making, and disguise. Shamil insists on realism, mock checkpoints, timed escape drills, and rehearsals in environments designed to mimic urban streets. One operation in 2004, aimed at disrupting a major transportation hub, illustrates his thinking. The plan calls for simultaneous actions. One team creates a diversion, drawing security forces away, while another moves in on the primary target. The goal is not just the damage inflicted, but the message sent, that nowhere is immune. For all the ruthlessness of these tactics, Shamil remains selective. He avoids targets that might alienate key supporters or erode the discipline of his network. In private, he is pragmatic. Civilian casualties may happen, but reckless violence without strategic value is discouraged. It's not morality, it's calculation. The Kremlin's response is swift and severe. Security sweeps intensify in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other major cities. Yet, each crackdown risks fueling resentment, particularly among ethnic minorities and migrant communities, which in turn can become fertile ground for recruitment. Shamil knows this, and he quietly encourages his operatives to seek out those already disillusioned with the state. From his vantage point in the highlands, these urban operations are like invisible threads tying the war together. Threads the Russians can't see until they're already tangled in them. For Shamil, the city is just another battlefield, and as long as the enemy's back is turned, he'll keep adding new threads, one by one. By the autumn of 2002, Moscow is shaken to its core. In the heart of the city, an operation unfolds that carries all the hallmarks of Shamil's planning: precision in execution, high-stakes leverage, and a willingness to gamble with the world watching. Though his direct presence is absent, his influence is woven through the Grozny Theater siege like thread through fabric. The target is the Dubravka Theater, packed for a popular musical performance. As the curtain rises, armed operatives, men and women dressed in dark fatigues, emerge from the aisles and take control. Within minutes, Hundreds of hostages are under their command, and demands are broadcast: the withdrawal of Russian forces from Chechnya. It's not just a hostage crisis, it's a statement, an attempt to drag the war back into the global spotlight. Shamil's role is the shadow behind the curtain. He has spent months before the siege helping to arrange logistics, vet operatives, and establish contact lines for negotiations. The operation draws on skills he's honed for years: infiltration, control of space, and psychological dominance over both captives and adversaries. The siege is designed to hold attention, not just from Moscow, but from every newsroom that can beam the images around the world. Inside the theater, the atmosphere is tense but oddly ordered. Hostages sit in their seats while masked figures patrol the aisles. There are moments of strange quiet, broken only by the occasional shout from a commander or the muffled sobs of someone in the crowd. Food is rationed, lights are dimmed. Every hour that passes is part of the pressure campaign against the Russian authorities. Outside, the standoff draws security forces, negotiators, and a swarm of journalists. Moscow's leadership faces a brutal calculation: concede to the demands and risk emboldening insurgents, or storm the building and risk catastrophic loss of life. The siege drags into days, each hour gnawing at public patience and political resolve. Many people still think that the Dubravka incident cemented Shamil's mastery of asymmetric warfare, not for the firepower displayed, but for the psychological weight it carried. This wasn't a battlefield victory. It was a message written in fear, broadcast into every home in Russia. The resolution comes in a way no one in the building can prepare for. Special forces flood the theater with an incapacitating gas before storming in. The chaos is immediate: shouts, gunfire, the thud of boots on the floorboards. Hostages collapse where they sit, some never to wake again. The operatives are killed, and the survivors among the captives are dragged into the cold Moscow night, coughing and dazed. In the aftermath, the Kremlin declares the siege proof of Chechen brutality, while Shamil's supporters point to it as evidence that the war can reach even the safest corners of Russia. For him, it's a strategic paradox. The operation failed to achieve its stated goal, yet succeeded in showing that the conflict could penetrate the Russian heartland. Back in the mountains, Shamil listens to the news reports, noting the outrage, the fear, and the political backlash. He knows Moscow will harden its grip on Chechnya in retaliation, but he also knows that each escalation comes with costs, and those costs are his opportunity. The theater siege has done what few battles could. It has made the war impossible to ignore. 2 years later, in September 2004, another crisis unfolds, one whose scale and horror eclipse even the events in Moscow. In the small North Ossetian town of Beslan, the first day of school is meant to be a celebration. Children arrive dressed neatly, parents in tow, carrying flowers for teachers. The air is bright with late summer sun. Within hours, that brightness collapses into a shadow that will stain the memory of the region for decades. A group of armed militants storms school number 1, herding more than 1,000 hostages, children, parents, teachers, into the gymnasium. Demands are issued: the withdrawal of Russian forces from Chechnya. Negotiations begin, but the situation is already brittle. The captors have wired the space with explosives, posted snipers, and cut off basic needs. The temperature inside the gym rises unbearably. Hunger, thirst, and fear tighten their grip on everyone trapped. Shamil's name surfaces almost immediately. Whether he directly planned the siege or merely sanctioned it remains a matter of dispute. But many of the militants involved have ties to his network. Intelligence briefings and later investigations link the operation's style, its preparation, its choice of a symbolic, high-profile target, to his influence. To his enemies, this is confirmation of his ruthlessness. To some in his circle, it is the ultimate escalation of a war fought on Russia's conscience. The siege drags into its third day. Inside, the hostages weaken. Outside, families cluster behind police lines, desperate for word. Negotiations make halting progress, then stall. The militants refuse offers they see as partial measures, demanding nothing less than complete withdrawal from Chechnya. When the end comes, it is chaos. Explosions rock the gymnasium, whether by accident or provocation remains disputed, and Russian forces storm the building. Gunfire erupts, mingled with screams. Hostages break through windows, some carrying injured children, others collapsing on the grass outside. By the time the shooting stops, more than 300 people are dead, over half of them children. Many people still think that Beslan was the point of no return for Shamil's public image. Whatever nuance or political framing he had tried to cultivate in earlier years evaporated in the face of such mass civilian loss. The Kremlin seizes on the tragedy to tighten control not only in Chechnya, but across the North Caucasus, using it to justify sweeping crackdowns. For Shamil, the strategic impact is double-edged. The siege shatters any lingering hope of political compromise, ensuring the conflict will remain a fight to the finish. It also deepens his isolation internationally. Even some of his former sympathizers abroad distance themselves, unwilling to be linked to the scale of Beslan's devastation. Yet within his hard-line base, the operation is framed as a brutal but necessary demonstration that Russia cannot be safe while occupying Chechnya. In the months after, Shamil moves deeper into the mountains, avoiding populated areas. Russian forces intensify their search, deploying more reconnaissance drones, informants, and special units. He responds by breaking his network into even smaller cells, making each one more difficult to track and dismantle. Winter finds him in a highland shelter, the wind howling through the passes outside. Around a small stove, his closest lieutenants argue about the future, whether to continue with large-scale hostage operations or return to smaller, more targeted strikes. Shamil listens, silent, his gaze fixed on the flames. The decision is his alone, but he knows that whatever course he chooses, the shadow of Beslan will follow him to the end. By 2005, Shamil's war has entered a phase that feels less like a campaign and more like a constant negotiation between survival and relevance. The Chechen resistance is fractured. Some leaders have been killed, others have fled, and a few have aligned themselves with Moscow in exchange for amnesty. Shamil, however, remains firmly outside the Kremlin's reach, moving like a phantom across the ridgelines and through the valleys of the Caucasus. His role now is as much political as it is military. He meets with rival Chechen commanders in secluded clearings, always arriving with just enough men to show strength without threatening his hosts. These gatherings are tense affairs, the air thick with both shared history and mutual suspicion. Shamil knows that without at least a veneer of unity, the movement will dissolve entirely, leaving Russia free to declare the insurgency finished. The challenge is that each faction has its own priorities. Some are driven by religion, others by nationalism, others still by profit. Shamil acts as a broker between them, offering weapons, safe passage, or intelligence in exchange for loyalty, or at least cooperation. Many people still think that this ability to bridge divides, even temporarily, is the only reason the resistance hasn't torn itself apart completely during these years. Beyond Chechnya, he cultivates ties with sympathetic groups in Dagestan, Ingushetia, and Kabardino-Balkaria. These alliances expand his operational reach, allowing him to stage attacks and retreats across a broader swath of the North Caucasus. Cross-border movement also gives him refuge when Russian operations in Chechnya grow too intense. Georgian highland villages, remote valleys in Dagestan, these places become temporary shelters where his men can rest, rearm, and vanish from immediate pursuit. But these alliances are fragile. Regional leaders want Shamil's resources and combat experience, but they don't always want his influence. He navigates this by giving just enough support to keep them dependent, while holding back enough to prevent them from standing on their own. It's a balancing act that demands constant vigilance. One spring meeting in the forests of Ingushetia captures this dynamic perfectly. Around a rough-hewn table, Shamil listens as a local commander complains about dwindling ammunition. He agrees to supply a shipment on the condition that his own fighters are allowed to use a nearby route for smuggling goods into Georgia. The commander hesitates, then nods. The deal is struck, sealed with a shared meal and a thin handshake. The Kremlin, for its part, sees these cross-border ties as proof that Shamil is not just a Chechen problem, but a regional threat. Russian special forces begin expanding their operations into neighboring republics, sometimes clashing with local security forces who resent the intrusion. This overreach works in Shamil's favor, as it breeds resentment and quietly increases the pool of people willing to aid him, if only out of spite toward Moscow. By the end of 2005, Shamil has managed to hold his position not through grand offensives, but through a web of relationships, deals, and strategic retreats. He is no longer chasing decisive victories. He's keeping the fire alive, making sure the war can't be declared over. And in the mountains where he moves, the very act of enduring is its own form of defiance. One cold evening, as snow begins to drift across the high passes, he stands outside a stone hut, looking toward the dark silhouette of the next ridge. The war has changed faces many times, but for him, the task is the same. Keep moving, keep striking, and never let the enemy believe you've grown tired. By 2006, the Russian security net is tightening. Federal forces have adapted to the guerrilla rhythms of the war, deploying smaller, faster units with better intelligence. Helicopters prowl the skies longer each day, and special forces now arrive within hours of a sighting. For Shamil, the mountains that once seemed like an impenetrable shield are becoming a cage. Still, he finds ways to slip through. His movements grow even more erratic, sometimes staying in one place for only a single night, other times lingering in remote hamlets for weeks under the protection of trusted villagers. He changes vehicles constantly, switches couriers mid-route, and keeps even his lieutenants guessing about his next destination. The unpredictability frustrates Russian forces and keeps him just beyond their grasp. The Kremlin intensifies its psychological campaign, spreading rumors of his death after every major operation, hoping to demoralize his network. Shamil counters by releasing occasional video and audio messages, grainy and unpolished, but unmistakably his. In these, he speaks directly to fighters and civilians alike, presenting himself as alive, unbroken, and still in command. Cross-border sanctuaries become more important than ever. Dagestan offers temporary hiding places, while the edges of Georgia's Pankisi Gorge serve as a back door for regrouping. These areas are dangerous. Russian intelligence works with local forces to hunt him, but they provide brief windows to rest and reorganize. Many people still think that his ability to operate across these borders is what keeps him alive at this stage, despite Moscow's growing dominance in Chechnya. During one summer escape, his convoy threads through a rugged Dagestani pass at night. The road is nothing more than a dirt ribbon clinging to the mountainside, the air heavy with the smell of pine and diesel. They move without headlights, the drivers relying on memory and moonlight to navigate. By dawn, they're deep enough into sympathetic territory to vanish from immediate pursuit. But these constant retreats come at a cost. Each crossing risks losing men to ambushes or accidents, and the shifting base of operations makes it harder to coordinate larger offensives. Shamil compensates by focusing on smaller, high-impact strikes that require minimal resources but deliver symbolic blows, attacks on police stations, ambushes on convoys, and targeted assassinations of pro-Moscow officials. He also sharpens his use of propaganda. Grainy footage of his fighters training in the mountains circulates through sympathetic networks abroad, reinforcing the image of an undefeated resistance. At the same time, he works to ensure that Russian narratives about his weakness are undercut by visible proof of activity. In the autumn of 2006, Russian forces claim to have cornered him in Ingushetia. The area is pounded with artillery, and troops sweep through village after village. Yet, when the operation ends, they find no trace, only spent shell casings, a burned-out hut, and a few scraps of paper left deliberately behind. One note, scrawled in Chechen, reads, "If you must chase shadows, at least bring a lantern." Whether he wrote it himself or ordered it planted, the message is unmistakable. He's still moving, still out of reach. For Shamil, each narrow escape reinforces the idea that survival itself is a weapon. The longer he lives, the longer the story of his defiance grows. And in this kind of war, stories are almost as dangerous as bullets. By early 2006, Shamil is spending more time outside Chechnya than in it. The hills and gorges of Ingushetia, Dagestan, and the Georgian borderlands become his roaming grounds, each offering temporary shelter, but no lasting safety. He moves like a migrating bird, always aware of the season, always ready to change course at the first sign of danger. These cross-border sanctuaries are not just hiding places, they're launch pads. From the wooded valleys of Dagestan, he sends small teams to harass Russian patrols along the frontier. From the Pankisi Gorge in Georgia, he coordinates arms deliveries and training for new recruits. The advantage is obvious. Russian forces cannot easily mount large-scale operations outside Chechnya without diplomatic fallout. The disadvantage is that every host region carries its own political risks, and Shamil has to manage these relationships as carefully as any battlefield maneuver. In Dagestan, he works through intermediaries, local contacts who handle the purchase of supplies and arrange discreet transport. In Ingushetia, the situation is more personal. Some families there still remember his past assistance during border skirmishes and offer shelter, though always with the quiet understanding that his presence invites danger. Many people still think that these years proved Shamil's true strength was his ability to function like a traveling warlord, untethered to any fixed base, surviving through a network that spanned republics and blurred the lines between ally and host. Operating beyond Chechnya also allows him to strike targets with more unpredictability. In one operation, his men cross from Ingushetia into Chechnya under the cover of a forest fire, using the smoke to mask their movement. They hit a Russian checkpoint, seize weapons and radios, and vanish back across the border before helicopters can arrive. The raid is small in scale, but large in psychological effect. It reminds Russian forces that geography is no shield. Still, the risks are growing. Moscow is leaning harder on neighboring republics to close their borders and crack down on any suspected militant movement. Special forces from multiple regions begin coordinating in ways Shamil hasn't seen before, pooling intelligence to track his routes. Villages once friendly to him now hesitate to offer shelter, fearing the retaliation that inevitably follows. One night in the Pankisi Gorge, as rain pelts the tin roof of a safe house, Shamil meets with a trusted Georgian contact. Over tea, they discuss the narrowing safe corridors and the increasing difficulty of moving men and supplies. The contact warns that Russian pressure is making even sympathetic locals nervous. Shamil listens without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When the man finishes, Shamil simply says, "Pressure is only dangerous if you stay still." It's a philosophy that has carried him this far. As long as he keeps moving, across borders, through alliances, between safe houses, he remains more than a target. He remains a question mark, a shifting presence that Moscow cannot pin down. And in a war like this, uncertainty is as potent a weapon as any rifle. The spring of 2006 brings Shamil close to death. It happens during a cross-border move between Ingushetia and Chechnya, in territory he's traveled dozens of times before. His convoy is small, 3 vehicles carrying fighters, supplies, and a pair of satellite radios. They're halfway through a winding gorge when the first mortar round lands. The ambush is well planned. Russian special forces, likely tipped off by an informant, have set up overlapping fields of fire along the high ridges. The second shell strikes the lead vehicle, sending shrapnel slicing through the air. Shamil is in the middle truck when an explosion rips through the roadside, flipping the vehicle onto its side. Pain floods his right leg, and for a moment, the world narrows to dust, ringing ears, and the smell of burning rubber. His men drag him out, half carrying him up a rocky incline as bullets snap past. They move in bursts, dash, drop, return fire, until they reach a fold in the terrain that hides them from view. Blood darkens Shamil's trousers, but the wound, though deep, hasn't shattered the bone. He orders them to keep moving. Staying still would mean encirclement. The retreat takes hours. By nightfall, they've reached a shepherd's hut used in past operations as a temporary cache. Here, under the dim light of an oil lamp, one of his fighters cleans the wound with boiled water and rough hands. Shamil refuses sedation, partly from pride, partly from the fear of dulling his senses. The pain is a sharp reminder that survival now depends as much on endurance as on cunning. For weeks, he moves only at night, avoiding main routes. Messages to his network are terse, relayed through trusted couriers. The injury slows him, but it doesn't stop him. In fact, many people still think that his reappearance just 2 months later, walking with a slight limp, only deepened his aura. The Russians had wounded him, but they hadn't ended him. During his recovery, his command style shifts. He delegates more to his lieutenants, granting them wider autonomy in planning and executing raids. This decentralization, born partly of necessity, makes his network more resilient. Even if he's pinned down or unable to move quickly, operations continue elsewhere. Small ambushes, targeted assassinations, and supply seizures that keep the resistance alive. By summer, he's back in the field, though careful to mask the extent of his recovery. When he meets with fighters in a Dagestani forest clearing, he leans casually on a walking stick, not as a sign of weakness, but as a quiet reminder that wounds are simply part of the work. His voice is steady, his orders clear. Avoid large confrontations, keep the routes open, and make every strike count. That night, As he rests under a rough canvas shelter, the mountain wind slips through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. The wound aches, but it's a familiar kind of pain now. One more scar in a life where survival is measured not by the absence of danger, but by the refusal to bow to it. By 2006's end, Shamil is moving with renewed urgency. The limp from his injury is still there, but so is the drive to strike hard before the Russians can tighten the noose. His intelligence sources warn that Moscow is planning a coordinated push in the coming months, one that will involve not only special forces, but also a sweeping campaign to dismantle the supply networks he spent years building. Rather than wait to be hunted, he opts for a final series of offensives. These aren't sprawling battles. They're sharp, deliberate blows aimed at military posts, police stations, and convoys that represent the Kremlin's grip on the region. His reasoning is simple. Each strike buys him time, forces the enemy to spread out, and sends a signal that even after years of war, he's still capable of dictating the pace. One operation in late November shows his approach at its most refined. A Russian convoy moves along a forest road, confident in its armored escort. Hidden in the trees, Shamil's fighters wait until the lead vehicle reaches a narrow bend. A remotely detonated explosive cripples it, blocking the road. Within seconds, gunfire rains down from both sides. The ambush lasts less than 7 minutes before his men fade back into the forest, leaving behind wrecked vehicles and confusion. Many people still think these closing offensives were less about military gain and more about legacy, proof to both allies and enemies that he would not fade quietly into the mountains. Logistically, the pressure is immense. Supplies have to be moved constantly to avoid seizure. Some depots are abandoned entirely, their contents redistributed among smaller caches. Couriers run longer, more dangerous routes to maintain communications between cells. Each successful delivery feels like a minor victory against the tightening Russian net. In private, Shamil is realistic. The losses his network has suffered, men, routes, equipment, are not easily replaced. Yet he refuses to let the movement stall. "If you stop," he tells the lieutenant one cold evening in the highlands, "they will say the war is over. As long as we keep moving, it isn't." The winter camps are lean. Fighters huddle in abandoned farmhouses or stone huts, their breath clouding in the frigid air. Supplies of food and fuel are thin, but morale stays alive through the promise of action. Shamil makes the rounds, speaking to small groups by firelight, reinforcing the idea that every strike, no matter how small, keeps the resistance breathing. By the start of 2007, the Russians are clearly preparing for something bigger. Surveillance flights increase. New checkpoints appear on roads that were once clear. Intelligence reports speak of infiltration attempts, operatives planted in villages long considered safe. Shamil knows what this means. The circle is closing, and the final campaign to end his life has already begun. But for now, in the frozen quiet of the high Caucasus, he's still out there, moving, planning, striking. Each step forward is taken with the knowledge that it could be his last, but also with the certainty that until that moment comes, the war is still his to fight. The summer of 2006 turns into a season of pursuit. Russian special forces intensify their hunt, no longer content with sporadic raids or ambushes. They want Shamil's head, and they are closing in with every operation. Helicopters sweep low over the valleys, armored vehicles grind along the mountain roads, and informants are paid handsomely for even the faintest trace of his movements. Shamil knows the pressure is different this time. It's not just a hunt. It's a coordinated elimination campaign, planned at the highest levels. His network has been thinned. Some lieutenants are dead, others scattered or in hiding. Even trusted villages hesitate before offering shelter, aware that harboring him now brings swift and brutal retaliation. Still, he refuses to disappear quietly. He travels with only a handful of men, moving mostly at night, sleeping in caves, abandoned huts, or beneath the open sky. Routes are chosen at the last moment, often changed mid-journey to throw off any pursuit. He carries little, just a rifle, a radio, and a small pack with essentials. Every extra burden is a liability. In late July, intelligence reaches him that Russian units are moving toward Ingushetia in force. The decision is made to cross into the region, hoping to use its rugged terrain and sympathetic contacts to evade capture. The journey is punishing. Narrow passes, steep climbs, sudden storms that turn paths into slick torrents. Each step is shadowed by the knowledge that an unseen drone or an informant's message could bring enemy forces within hours. Many people still think that by this stage, Shamil understood his end was near. The moves he made were not aimed at rebuilding his network, but at staying alive long enough to make one final statement, whether through another high-profile strike or by simply refusing to be taken alive. In Ingushetia, he links up with a small safe-house crew, old allies from past operations. Supplies are meager, and the air is thick with tension. They keep their conversations quiet, their plans fluid. Even within the group, details of movements are shared at the last possible moment. Each man knowing the risk of betrayal grows the longer they linger. By August, Russian special forces are sweeping the countryside. The mountains feel smaller now, less like a fortress and more like a closing trap. Helicopters hover at dawn, and distant bursts of gunfire echo through the valleys. Shamil sleeps lightly, waking at the faintest sound, his rifle always within reach. One night, as he sits outside the safe house under a sky littered with stars, he says quietly to a companion, "When the time comes, it will come quickly. The trick is to keep moving until then." His tone is calm, almost resigned, but there's still a glint in his eyes, the same sharp calculation that's kept him alive for over a decade of war. In the weeks ahead, that calculation will be tested to its final limit, August 2006. The mountains of Ingushetia are heavy with heat, the air thick and unmoving in the valleys. Shamil's small group moves with deliberate care, keeping off main tracks and sticking to goat paths that wind through the ridges. Supplies are low, but speed and silence matter more than comfort now. Every rumor says the Russians are closing in, and each hour feels like borrowed time. The safe house they choose is modest, a squat building of stone and timber, half hidden by scrub. It has served as a rest point before, a place to eat, sleep, and plan the next move. But this time, it feels different. The men move more quietly, conversations cut short. The sense that something unseen is pressing in is impossible to ignore. At dawn on August 10th, the sound comes first. Rotor blades, distant but approaching fast. Then, the faint rumble of armored vehicles from the road below. The trap has sprung. Russian special forces, tipped by intelligence, have encircled the area. There's no time to debate or negotiate. The fight begins before the group can even finish packing. Automatic fire rattles through the trees, the sharp crack of rifles answered by the deeper thud of grenades. Shamil directs his men to split and maneuver, trying to buy space, but the enemy's perimeter is too tight. Dust and smoke fill the air. A vehicle erupts in flames down the slope. A blast rocks the safe house. a planted charge, or perhaps a grenade. Shamil is thrown to the ground, his ears ringing. He pushes himself up, blood running from a gash on his forehead, and scans the chaos. The fight is hopeless now, but surrender is not an option. In this war, capture means more than death. It means a slow dismantling of everything he's built. Many people still think the end came by design. A sudden explosion near the building's rear, some say from a detonated device, others from incoming fire, ends Shamil's life instantly. The blast leaves little doubt for the Russian forces who close in to confirm the kill. His body, they later claim, is identified on the spot. In Moscow, officials announced the operation as a decisive victory, the death of the most wanted man in the North Caucasus. In Chechnya, news travels in murmurs, mixing disbelief with quiet acknowledgement that his absence leaves a gap no one can fully fill. The war will continue, but the figure who shaped it for over a decade is gone. In the villages, the memory of him is complicated. For some, he is the man who stood against impossible odds, a symbol of defiance carved into the mountains themselves. For others, he is the architect of suffering, the one who brought the war's cruelty into their homes. Yet even among his harshest critics, there's a recognition that he shaped the course of the conflict in ways no one else could. The ridges of Ingushetia grow quiet again in the days after. The safe house is abandoned, the scrub reclaims the ground, and only the echoes of gunfire remain. A brief flare marking the end of a long, relentless fight. So, here we are at the quiet edge of the story. The gunfire has faded, the smoke has cleared, and the man at the center of so many years of chaos is now a part of history. Whatever you think of Shamil Basayev, warlord, freedom fighter, criminal mastermind, or something in between, his life was lived at the very edge of survival, a place where every choice had weight and every day might be the last. The mountains he knew so well are still there. They stand as they always have, their slopes marked by old trails and the faint outlines of places where fires once burned. Seasons will keep changing in those valleys, snow burying the high passes in winter, rivers rushing with meltwater in spring, the air warm and heavy with pine in summer. Somewhere in those hills, there will always be a whisper of the lives that passed through. Stories will be told in low voices, over tea, or in the shadow of a stove's warm glow. The details will blur with time, as they always do, but the feeling will remain. The mix of fear, respect, anger, and awe that surrounded a man who walked between worlds. And now, as you're listening, maybe the night around you has grown a little quieter too. The hum of your own space, the fan in the corner, the faint rustle of fabric, the breathing of someone sleeping nearby, can fill the silence the story leaves behind. Let the weight of the mountains fade from your thoughts. Let the noise of battles, the rush of narrow escapes, and the tension of so many years dissolve into the stillness of now. The story has ended, but the night continues.